Thank you so much for welcoming me tonight for Pride Shabbat. So good Shabbos, Gwen Shabbat, happy Pride. And I am going to share some thoughts with you about the value of queer and transgender leadership in Jewish communities, including humanistic communities, and why I think leaders from marginalized communities are good for everyone, regardless of your own personal identity. So I'm going to start by telling you about a Yiddish movie, and I'm going to show you my one last slide here. The most successful Yiddish film of all time was about a girl who dresses as a boy. In the 1936 musical, Yiddle Mitten Fiddle, Yiddle with his fiddle, Itka plays the violin with her father in a klezmer band and disguises herself as a boy named Yiddle for her own safety, so that she can travel from town to town playing at weddings. So that was Yiddle. That's my last picture for you. And I began playing the violin when I was 7 years old. I began learning to play Yiddish songs when I was 9 or 10 from my father. My grandmother had also played them. I began experimenting with my gender presentation in my late teens. So I'm not sure when I first heard of Yiddle Mitten Fiddle or the Yiddish song that has the same name, but over time, this image that we saw of a gender-bending klezmer fiddler became a part of my own identity. I would dress up as Yiddle for Purim, which is the queerest of all Jewish holidays, if you didn't know. And I later began performing on stage, dressed in a fedora, a suit jacket, and pinstripe pants. I wish I had a picture of that for you. A few years later, I started experimenting with my pronouns and eventually settled on they, them. Though that could always change again. So in the film, Yiddle doesn't identify as a boy, but she looked like me or like I wanted to look. So that image, that face of a classic Yiddish story, was powerfully validating and encouraging to me as a Jewish young adult. So is it a trans story? Maybe not. It's a queer story. Some Jewish studies scholars definitely think it is. And it's a story about ambiguity, crossing borders, crossing the lines that contain people in categories, crossing the lines that divide people. So let me tell you some more stories about Jews, ambiguity, and border crossing. The first known Jewish immigrant to what is now Canada arrived from France in 1738 under the name Jacques Lafargue. Sorry for my French pronunciation, dressed in boys' clothes. Jacques was found to have formerly gone by the name Esther Brandeau and was raised by Jewish parents. Jacques/Esther wanted to, quote, enjoy the same liberty as Christians, unquote, but Jews were not allowed in Canada. So Jacques/Esther was sent back to France. In the early 1930s, a University of Chicago divinity student reported attending a drag ball in Bronzeville on New Year's Eve. He described people of diverse genders and ethnicities, drag queens, drag kings, dancing to jazz, and he noted, quote, a preponderance of Jews and Latin nationalities, unquote, along with white and black patrons mixing freely, adding that there seemingly is no race distinction between them. Then in 1897, going back a bit, the German doctor Magnus Hirschfeld, who was born to a Jewish family, although he didn't practice Jewish religion or culture, founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which advocated for the decriminalization of homosexuality. He then went on to coin the term transvestite and offered counseling and legal help to gender nonconforming people through his Institute for Sexual Science in the Weimar Republic of Germany. The Institute was a pioneer in developing hormone therapies and is thought to have been the first to perform gender reassignment surgery. As a result of this work, Hirschfeld was one of the Nazis' earliest targets. He was held up as an example of degenerate Jewish sexuality and Jewish perversion, and the Institute's library was burned in 1933. So the Encyclopedia of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that Hirschfeld described a continuous range of unique gender identities, between which, he said, there are no empty points present, but rather unbroken connecting lines. In 1993, 60 years after Hirschfeld's library was burned, Leslie Feinberg published a pamphlet called Transgender Liberation, a movement whose time has come. Feinberg grew up in a working-class Jewish family and publicly identified as a secular Jew, and is considered to be a founder of the contemporary transgender movement. That pamphlet, Transgender Liberation, documented widespread evidence of transgender people in traditional cultures around the world. Feinberg described people who cross-dressed and took on occupations and roles associated with the gender other than the one that they were assigned at birth, including family roles, marriages, and highly respected community leadership positions on every continent, including 135 North American native nations. Feinberg said about Here novel, Feinberg used Z here pronouns, the novel Stone Bitch Blues, like my own life, this novel defies easy classification. So finally, in 2012, Kate Bornstein, who we heard from earlier, published a book called A Queer and Pleasant Danger, the true story of a nice Jewish boy who joins the Church of Scientology and leaves 12 years later to become the lovely lady she is today. So Bornstein is a leader in the contemporary trans movement and describes being raised in the 1950s in a more or less secular Jewish family. And Bornstein writes, "I'm not a man and I'm not a woman. I break too many rules of both these genders to be one or the other. I transgress gender. You could call me transgressively gendered. You could call me transgender. Me, I call myself a traveler." So trans Jews have been around for a long time, and some of the most important leaders I discovered in researching this, some of the most important leaders of the transgender movement have been self-described secular Jews. So what about trans leadership in Jewish communities, which is what I've promised to talk to you about? Well, in 2006, Elliot Kukla was ordained at HUC, Hebrew Union College, the seminary of the Reform movement, and he became the first openly trans rabbi. He co-founded the site transtorah.org with Rabbi Reuben Zellman, who is the author of the Twilight People reading earlier. And they publish blessings, rituals for gender transition, explanations of how the Torah and the Talmud address trans and intersex people, which is a really fascinating topic of its own, and advice for welcoming trans people into Jewish communities, and a lot more. And I remember seeing the blessing for chest binding, which is a practice that's done by some transmasculine people. I remember seeing that one of the very first things that I ever read that showed me that there were people who were openly trans and Jewish. In 2008, Professor Joy Layden transitioned and returned to her position at Yeshiva University as a woman, making her the first out trans employee of an Orthodox institution. She's written on trans theory and theology, and she speaks nationally on transgender issues. So now, today, trans and non-binary rabbis lead Reconstructionist, Reform, and conservative congregations in New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Berkeley, and looking at my fellow rabbinic students in Reconstructionist and non-denominational seminaries, I've met a lot of other rabbinic students in other sections of Judaism, I can assure you there are many more trans rabbis to come. So why is this significant? And why is it good not just for trans individuals, but for our communities as a whole? So I'd like to share 3 ways that trans leadership can strengthen our own humanistic Jewish communities. So first, as we've seen, when we embrace trans leadership, we embrace our own youth, the children and grandchildren of our own community members, maybe members of your own families. 18% of Gen Z young adults, people under the age of 24, identify as LGBTQ, which, by the way, is still lower than what Alfred Kinsey found in his studies of human sexuality. 2% of high schoolers in the US today identify as transgender. So queer and trans young people make up a significant part of our own communities. I have no doubt that Jewish communities are no different than those general statistics. So I'm glad that I found Yiddle and I found a blessing for chest binding when I was a young adult, and I want to pay that forward. So when we see people, when we see people who look like us, who sound like us, or who identify like us on the screen, in our folklore, in our history, in front of the room, we feel empowered, validated, and safe to be ourselves. So embracing trans leadership means welcoming and valuing our own children, the next generation of humanistic Jews. Second, when we embrace leadership from one marginalized group, we open ourselves to welcoming people from many marginalized groups. So if you recall the 1930s drag ball, where there was, quote, no race distinction, where queer and trans Jews gathered with others, crossing lines of gender and race. Or Leslie Feinberg, who found connections between cultures across the globe that recognized the roles of trans and gender variant people in their societies. In my own master's thesis research on Jewish diasporism, I found that in contemporary communities of young Jewish activists who embrace diverse Jewish cultures of the diaspora and they advocate for ethical Jewish relationships to land, also tend to be queer. So in one interview I did with a group of 3 young Jewish activists, all 4 of us went by they, them pronouns. And nobody ever mentioned this during that entire interview because it was just so unremarkable, so common in those communities. So third, when we embrace border crossing, gender ambiguity, when we embrace Magnus Hirschfeld's unbroken connected lines and Kate Bornstein's transgressive gender, we create spaces that can be liberating for everybody. After all, humanistic Judaism is a crossing of boundaries between the religious and the secular, and the sacred and the profane. And Jewishness itself can even be seen as border crossing. Is it a religion or a culture? It's a community that has crossed dozens of borders between empires, continents, nations throughout history, always adapting to the cultures where we found ourselves, while also maintaining distinct practices. In fact, it might be this very ambiguity that so angered the people who burnt Hirschfeld's archives, both for his Jewishness and for his gender transgression. And that continues to anger the far right today, as we see continuing backlash against the trans movement alongside many types of backlash. So I would like to conclude by asking, where can you embrace ambiguity in your own life? What borders have you crossed? Whether geographic borders, borders of the mind, borders of the heart, what parts of you transgress, expand beyond their confines, or don't fit neatly into one category or another? And how might the stories of trans Jewish leadership that I've shared with you tonight inspire you to embrace those parts of yourself? So thank you again for welcoming me to share with you tonight, and giving me the opportunity to learn these stories myself and share them. And I would love to open the conversation up. So thank you. You can unspotlight me. And I just like to open to any questions anybody would like to ask of me, or Jenny has also said that he is open to questions, or any thoughts you'd like to share on this topic of gender or ambiguity, or any other connections you might have made tonight.
Well, Claire, I want to thank you so much. That was really interesting, really good. And you made me think of something when you talked about really the idea of the nuance. So any of us who have tried to explain humanistic Judaism to someone who didn't get it or thought it didn't make any sense and it was weird and it wasn't valid. I mean, I can't imagine that any of us haven't run into that, but in trying to explain something that has some nuance and has not definite, not everyone in humanistic Judaism thinks the exact same thing. So we can't always answer on behalf of the community. And I feel like the response that we sometimes get has some similarities to explaining what does it mean if you're gender non-binary, or what does it mean? And the same kind of sometimes annoyance. Well, I don't get it. That doesn't make sense. And it would just be easier for all of us if you would just stick to the things that we set up originally, because it's, it makes more sense. So it seems like we've all, I guess I didn't think of humanistic Judaism in that way, but it is a similar thing that we've probably all experienced.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, when Kate Bornstein says she's a queer and pleasant danger, I like to think it's, confuse people. It's okay. Let them be confused for a while.
Right.
Helps us all grow.